Our first reading is from the book of Esther, a rather short book within the Bible, and one that we as Christians do not spend much time with. Part of this is that the book of Esther is a fictional story that, in the original Hebrew, was not particularly religious. In the Hebrew version, God is not even mentioned. Later, when the book of Esther was being read by those living under Greek oppression, additions were made that appear in the Apocrypha section of the Anglican and Episcopal Bibles. Whereas previous generations had been oppressed for existing as a small nation in the midst of empires at war with one another, and for being a visible minority group in foreign lands, during the Greek occupation of Judea and Galilee, it was the Jewish religion that was specifically suppressed. For these later generations, writing into the book of Esther, their own experiences of oppression made the text more accessible. While these additions are present in our Bible and those of Catholics and Orthodox Christians, amongst Protestant Christians and Jews, these additions are absent, as the Hebrew text is the basis of their translations. Without these additions, the book of Esther is very much the story of a young woman, someone lacking traditional power, bravely saving her people, rather than a story of religious resistance. The inclusion of the text in the canon of the Jewish scriptures was somewhat controversial as a result. And tradition holds it was the last book to be included in the scriptures when the Jewish canon was set in the 4th century BCE. In rabbinical Judaism, that is, Judaism that developed after the destruction of the temple from the writings of the Pharisees and their successors, the annual reading of the Scroll of Esther became part of the celebration of the Feast of Purim. Unlike most feast days in the Jewish tradition, women are explicitly required to at least listen to the public reading of this scroll, and in all but the most conservative traditions, to be part of that reading. Many of the other traditions associated with the feast are centered around the traditional roles of women and their subversive powers in even the most patriarchal societies. Children wear costumes and parade in the streets, similar to the American tradition of Halloween, but in March rather than October. Food and drink are exchanged between friends and relatives, and gifts are made to the poor as well. A special meal is held, with alcohol being served prominently, and women gather to apply henna to one another and celebrate together in a women's-only space. Overall, there are two themes at work in these celebrations. First, there is a prominence brought to the role of women and the importance they hold in the history of the survival of the Jewish people. But there is also the theme of hiding and camouflaging, sent to represent the hidden way that God brings miracles into being through seemingly natural phenomenon and chance, but also as a way to preserve anonymity for givers and receivers of charity. That said, we are Christians. We are not Jewish. We do not celebrate Purim. What are we meant to do with this strange story? Well, I think we need to start with where I started. The story of Esther is a story of fiction. And as much as our first reading has Haman being hung upon the gallows that he had erected to murder Mordecai, it is still very much sanitized. The plot Haman conceived was one very reminiscent of the very real genocide that occurred in Rwanda. Haman commanded all of the non-Jewish people throughout the kingdom to murder their Jewish neighbors on a specific date at a specific time. And he had so whipped up suspicion and prejudice against this minority group that many of those neighbors were prepared to fulfill his command even after he was executed. The story of Esther therefore ends with the Jewish people having been armed by Esther, Mordecai, and the king, killing their own would-be murderers. But again, this never happened. It was a revenge fantasy, and a story about the ways that God remains loyal and lifts up the humble and creates unexpected heroes. But genocide, even in the face of genocide, is never acceptable. All life is precious. And as in the model of Paul, even those who hate us the most can be transformed by God. But the book of Esther does remind us, at a time when anxieties regarding national identity, financial well-being, and climate change are rising with each day, that any attempt to scapegoat or blame any minority group for those anxieties must be firmly resisted. We must be willing to speak up and oppose any rumors or laws that may lead to violence or discrimination against the poor, the disenfranchised, the widows, the orphans, and the foreigners who dwell in our land. Second, in this work of opposing oppression of the vulnerable, we must follow in the way of Jesus and be willing to join with the righteous people of all faiths and even those with no faith in doing the work of Jesus. After all, as is stated in our gospel today, whoever is not against us is for us. And third, we must recognize that we ourselves can become the oppressors of the vulnerable in our land when granted power, and resist the urge to abuse that power or seek revenge for real or imagined slights. As is made clear in our gospel today, we are called through our faith in Jesus to cut off those parts of ourselves that would seek a revenge or abuse others, and instead always choose solidarity with the oppressed. Amen.